Welcome, everybody, to Prime the Pump podcast. I'm here with Dave Morehouse, lead pastor of Journey Church. I'm Brent Hudson, teaching pastor at the Journey Church. And today we're going to talk about the weekend's message. And we kind of rounded a corner. We've had a couple of weeks talking about really difficult things. And this week we're going to talk about conversion. So that's kind of an interesting topic. What do you think, Dave, when you look at Jacob's life and this idea of conversion?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting as we look at this part of Jacob's story where the key phrase is he wrestles with God.
Right.
And I just think that so often for so many people, whether they call themselves Christians or believers, or whether they just would think of themselves as either agnostic, maybe even atheistic, or just inquirers or whatever, or unsure, or spiritual. I mean, there's so many phrases in our culture today. But I would say that there's still something about this ancient story of where Jacob is wrestling with God, and he walked away never the same again, that I think that's a story for us too. And my heart always is with people, regardless of where you're at in your walk or relationship with God, is that, are you wrestling with God?
Right.
Are you encountering him?
Yeah, that encounter with God is so important, and the deep personal interaction encounter, right? Not just, oh yeah, I thought about God, I had an encounter with the idea about God, but an actual personal encounter with God that we see in Jacob. He's face to face with God. I mean, I can't help but think about that passage in Genesis 2:4, where God builds this clay statue and then comes up to the statue face to face and breathes the breath of life into the first human, right? And you have that very intimate, close, face-to-face contact between God and the original person. And here you have Jacob. Now it's wrestling, of course. There's this struggle going on, but yet it's still this face-to-face encounter. In fact, Peniel, where it happened, that's what Jacob calls the place at the Jabbok, because it's face-to-face. He saw God face-to-face. And it's a very deep, personal encounter with God that changed his life.
Yeah. And of course, when we think about him encountering God, I know part of the story is actually his hip was touched, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And I just think there's so many metaphors to that in our own journey of life and faith, that sometimes in that genuine encounter with God, we are effective in ways that maybe we become aware of our brokenness, our weakness, or we're marked in a way that we're never the same. I think too, Brent, that when I think about the younger generations behind us, which seems to be a growing number.
It's getting ever larger, Dave.
An ever larger number. I don't know what that is. Seems like we're getting to the head of the line. But I think I find that there is a hunger for people to not just talk about God or a God idea, as you said, to really meet God. And I think that one thing, I'll just say, I think that one thing when we try to do a community of faith church, whatever the denominational tag we wear or whatnot, is to just say, are we creating a space in our community of faith, whether it's, I'm not just talking about a formal service, but that and other places where we're allowing people to just say, you need to meet God. You just meet him.
And you mentioned the fact that God touched his hip and he walked with a limp. And that became, as the text says in Genesis, sort of a symbol, if you will, of that reality of the encounter that Jacob had with God. And it's interesting because, maybe 30 years from that point, someone could say, is Jacob just making stuff up? But the hip and the limp for Jacob, it reminded him of that very real moment where he was face to face with God. And, we kind of yearn for that in our own lives, right? That deeply personal experience that we have with God, with Christ, that we can go back to years later And no matter how many new doubts we have, no matter how many struggles we may be encountering and feeling like we don't have the energy perhaps to even push forward through the new challenges in front of us, we can look back to that moment and we can remember the reality of that moment. And it puts some wind in our sails to lean into some of the challenges that are in front of us. And for Jacob, the challenge was he had to meet his brother Esau. When he came face to face with God, it meant that he was going to have to deeply look into his own life and do some reparation, some repairs to the relationships that he had, broken. He had to see his own role in the brokenness of his family and of his own life, and he had to start making amends. And so when we come close to God, when we meet God, we see that there is a ripple effect. The reverberations of that spread out through every other relationship in our lives too. It's a very interesting story when we look at Jacob and how it wasn't just he had a spiritual experience and that was it.
That's right. And actually, I think in this story of meeting God, he also came to know himself in a profound new way. And of course, in the story, his name went from being called Jacob to being called Israel.
That's right.
Which, of course, we think about the country of Israel and of today, and yet we don't want to ever lose sight of the fact that the root meaning of Israel, and you can clarify this for me because you're the Hebrew scholar, but one definition I understand is that the name means, contend with God or, fight with God.
Yeah. Or even God fights, so there is this, it's again, that relational idea, right? God is fighting for us and it's often we're fighting with God, right? I mean, that's often how it works, isn't it?
Yeah. And I guess for me though, the whole idea that sometimes, and I know today in our world, we talk a lot about what's my identity. And I think that this story reminds us that if you're really going to know your real identity, it's when you come and wrestle with God, encounter God, and God is the one. And as our Christian faith story tells us, it's in Christ that we are given. We don't define our own identity. Right. God gives us a new identity in Christ.
That's right. I mean, Jacob wouldn't have chosen that name for himself. That was a name that probably wasn't even on his mind, but God gave it to him, and then he owned it, right? So likewise with Christ.
Powerful. Yeah, I think that's powerful. That again, because I think sometimes people are always trying to, on their own, come up with their own identity, and I think the story of faith is that it's God who gives us our identity, and I think people have to wrestle with that. But I think it's really liberating too.
Absolutely. No, it's just a fantastic story. It seems to touch almost every part of our human existence in relationship with others. So I'm looking forward to hearing the different voices. I guess at the Journey Church, we're going to have multiple voices this weekend.
That's right. So we're going to be having Dr. Seth Kroll at our Allison campus. We're going to be having Pastor Jarvis Lepper at our TJC Riverview campus, and we'll be having Blake Dawson in our online digital first service. So yeah, it's a great time to let other voices be heard here at the Journey Church family.
Absolutely. Look forward to the weekend, Dave. Have a good one.
All right, I'm as well.
All right. Bye for now.